Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to what is the 30th anniversary of these public seminars that we've been doing at Stanford. I'm Richard Dasher. I direct the US-Asia Technology Management Center, and the center puts on this set of seminars ever since back in 1992. And I'm actually very happy to see that among the people who are joining us on Zoom this afternoon is Mr. Sheridan Tatsuno. And Sheridan was one of the first people in the center way back in 1992. So welcome, and welcome to everybody. This is hybrid. We are running the programs in person for students at Stanford and by Zoom for those who can't join us in person. Stanford policy is that students should wear masks in the classroom. We don't have the Gestapo waiting outside to see, but that is the policy. And if you are taking a drink of water or something like that, or you can remove your mask. The distinctive thing about these seminars, there are a number of seminars like this at Stanford now, but we were the first to have a mixed audience of students and people from the Silicon Valley business community. And this goes back to the reason we got started. We were started on a US government grant to bring information about new science and technology developments at the time in Japan to the Silicon Valley technical community. And from that, we have gradually evolved over the years to focus more on processes of innovation and new areas of business creation. And we've also evolved our business model in something that the US government should be very happy about. We fulfilled one of the aims of a government grant that almost no one ever fulfills. We kept the program going on other funding. We have no government money now. We are an industry affiliates program that is supported by member companies. The names of the member companies were rotating around on the slides before the session started. And we're thankful to all 17 of our member companies for their support, which allows us to put on this series and hopefully have some networking with people along from time to time. So if you're taking the course for credit, of course, you have to register. The second point is that we would like for you to send a weekly comment to me by email that contains something in your comment that shows you watched the session. You don't have to give a complete summary of the session, but it's something that, some detail or something that struck you about the session. And that's the pedagogical value of this. If you're thinking about the session afterward in order to write a comment, then you're probably going to remember more about it. The comment is due to me by email within 2 weeks of the date of the session. And that pretty much applies throughout. The second requirement, now that Stanford is back to in-person classes, is for in-person attendance. Now, if there is a conflict, scheduling conflict, with a required course or another required activity, for instance, you're on a sports team, you can send me an email and ask to participate this whole quarter by watching the videos on YouTube. As you noticed, we're recording the session. We'll put up the seminar tape on YouTube within a few days. And so you can watch it on YouTube and still send me the comment, right, within a couple of weeks. But if it's not something that is kind of a conflict you cannot avoid, still send me a note and let me know. And if you miss more than one session during the quarter, we'll work out a makeup assignment. And I'll try to make the makeup assignment not punitive, but something that will really be valuable for you too. So the time of the official class is 5:30 to 7 in the evening. We'll probably go for more like an hour and 15 minutes in this formal recorded session. And then when we kind of run out of good questions from the audience, I'll say that we're stopping the recording and we'll continue the discussion in an off the record format for a few minutes more. So please plan on staying until 7 o'clock. Are there any questions, especially from anybody who wants to take this for credit? Okay, you can always send me a note by email. My contact is on my last slide, and I'll be happy to hear from you. One thing I do want to ask is for our participants by Zoom, during the course of the session, if you have a question or comment, please write it in the chat window. So that way I'll just read it out to everybody. Otherwise, the sound gets too complicated. And that's another difference between this formal session of the class and the off the record networking. I'll invite people on Zoom to talk and give their comments verbally once we stop recording. So that's the way things work. Today, after this brief introduction that I just gave you, we're going to start with a feature really about the economics of ESG with Dr. Amit Kapoor, who is the Honorary Chair of the Institute for Competitiveness in India. He's the CEO of the India Council on Competitiveness. He's a lecturer. We're going to team teach a course this winter quarter. And he's also affiliate faculty for the Harvard Business School. We're really delighted that, Amit, you can be here with us today. And I think the thing for me to do is to get out of my slide share and let you take over. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard. And it's an honor for me to be here today on the 30th anniversary session. And I'm very much looking forward to teaching the course together with you. So perfect. So just in terms of like the session that we have today on ESG, I really wanted to give a certain view in terms of like how I really look at this whole problem of environment and social and governance and so on and so forth. And I'll try to bring in a perspective from India and especially more from Asia as well. So if you really look at it, this is the broad agenda that I had. So what is the urgency that we are really talking about? Why this urgency at all? Are we really facing a crisis of sorts? Maybe yes, maybe not. Should we prioritize these sustainable development goals, or is it just a big bang idea that people have, or it's a marketing ploy that has actually happened? How people can actually, or how corporations can actually, of course, the idea of price for environment. Having said this, if you really look at it, like we are facing one of the biggest crises that the world has seen, or since the humanity has actually started. Whether we like it or we don't like it, the question is that we are going to be facing the most catastrophic climatic situations in the next decades or so, or in many years to come. In fact, right now it is just happening in your backyard in Florida. That is an exact reflection of how climate change can actually have an impact. There are going to be extreme weather conditions or extreme climatic changes that you would actually be seeing over a period of time. But having said that, 61% of the population which lives in the Asian continent, they are going to be facing far more crisis or far more critical situation than people can actually imagine. If you really look at it, like the seawater or the water levels are going to rise, we are expecting that countries like Bangladesh will get reduced to half their size. In fact, in a country like India, we are expecting the Ganges to dry down, which is the biggest river in the country, Ganga to dry down by the year 2060, 2070. If that happens, that means 600 million to 700 million people will actually be devoid of water. And then, of course, the extreme weather in terms of the rise in temperature by 1.5 degrees centigrade would mean that the location is actually going to be uninhabitable or become very, very difficult to live. This year is a very interesting reflection of what has actually happened in India, wherein the temperatures went close to about 50 degrees centigrade, which is roughly about 123 in actual locations. Like, so if you really talk about the Death Valley here, we were talking about those level of temperatures where close to about 600 million people live. So that means there is a huge impact that climate or weather is actually going to have on our lives over a period of time. But then again, the question is that how do we really bring these mitigation strategies? How is it that people can actually come together? Is it going to be the government which has to do something, or is it going to be the corporations which has to do, who have to do something, Or is it that it'll be the individuals who have to do something about this? But moving ahead, uh, there are other situations or other challenges that actually arise. And when I am talking about these problems give rise to the biggest opportunities that the world has actually seen. Uh, we can always have a debate whether this is something which is man-made or is it something which is happening because of the very natural processes or whatever. But at the end of the day, these are problems which have to be solved for the world, for the betterment of the people that we are really talking about. The biggest four being air quality, water, waste, and standard of living or social progress for people. If you really look at air quality is one of the biggest challenges in the Asian region. And I'm focusing on Asia. When you are living in a place like say Stanford or Palo Alto, you actually find one of the cleanest air qualities or whatever. So you don't even understand what pollution is all about. You have to go to a place like India or China to really understand what pollution is all about. At least within India, we can boast of that out of the top 40 cities or the most polluted cities in the world, just about 35 of them are in India. So we are one of the most polluted regions. You actually talk about air quality index, which is absolutely abysmal. There have been studies after studies which have been done, which show that it actually has a huge impact on the quality of life of people or on their health over a period of time, because it would actually give rise to huge sets of issues as we move along. And but then the question is, why does this pollution get created, or is it something which is man-made, or is it something, or is it because of a developmental exercise? Uh, Again, it is not only about industrialization that we are actually seeing this pollution. It is about our basic practices of how people do things. This is a very interesting map which I thought I'd share with you. This is a picture from NASA, which shows the fires that are burning in the region. And this is typically during the time of the agricultural produce, or when they're actually just lighting up the agricultural waste or burning up the agricultural waste. So this is what India actually looks like. So 40% of India's pollution is happening because of stubble burning. So it is because of agricultural practices that we are seeing it. It is not only about industrialization. It is also about how people behave, how farmers behave, and so on and so forth. But the thing is that we all talk about COVID and because of how COVID has actually created shutdowns or closure of schools. But in India, we saw for the first time this year that schools started closing down because of pollution. So that means we are actually talking about huge issues here. And when you suddenly talk about closure of schools, that means there is a huge learning loss that actually happens. In fact, during COVID, you must have actually noticed that there are kids who were not able to get to school, but people lost close to about 6 years of there is a learning loss of 6 years, or the recovery time is 6 years. That's a better way of putting it. So kids who were not able to get to school for 2 years, they will take about 6 years to recover from the learning loss that has actually happened. So that means every single day that a person misses school, he misses learning for about at least 6 to 8 days. That means it's a very critical thing that we need to find a solution for this, because future of humanity is all about education, and how do we really get this education right? Uh, but again, a need to reduce carbon intensity in Asian economies, uh, without a doubt. In fact, if you really look at this graph, you would actually notice that it is not that in the developing world, it's the South African locations which are far more polluting than India and China. But as a collective, as an aggregate, these are the countries which really do pollute a lot. So we need to find a measure in which we are able to reduce this level of pollution over a period of time. So can we actually move to transition or move to clean energy? That is one of the things that we really have to talk about. It is certainly possible, but the question is going to be that how do we change the practices that we actually have today? If you really look at a country like India, I do see a certain Indian faces out here, so they'll understand what I'm saying as to how housewives were actually using what I call agriculture-based or cow dung-based fuels in their homes or at their homes. So once they're actually using it, it is very, very polluting. So how do we remove that from the basics of really from creating those basic solutions for our people? So of course, the government of India has actually done a lot of things around it. They have created measures around it. But now the question is that are those measures sufficient enough? If we are able to replace that fuel with say, gas or what you call as liquefied petroleum gas at the homes, and you're able to create that replacement cycle. But does that mean that we are in a position to really take that towards a longer period of time? Do people have the money to do it or not? This leads us to a very important question of the question of quality of life of people. This is something which is going to improve the quality of life of people, but how is it that we are able to actually move forward on that? Water is another issue that we really have to understand across the world. In fact, as I said, a country like India is going to be devoid of water, or at least 600 million people will not know what to do in the next 30 to 40 years. So we need to find solutions for water over a period of time. But now, again, the question that arises here is that what are the kind of water problems, or why does this actually happen? So it is inefficient use of irrigation, or poor intersectoral water allocation that happens, or surface water pollution that happens, and such things. In fact, this is a very important graph that we have to look at. We just looked at some data in terms of like how water levels are there in Indian districts. And what we find is that 111 districts in India are overexploited. That means you're not replenishing groundwater on exactly the same rate at which you're extracting the water. That means we are actually creating a situation, or you are creating an ecological crisis of sorts. You are depleting that water level, and over a period of time, you would actually talk about desertification. In fact, if any one of you is from India and who has been to a place like Delhi, you would notice that you are actually living in a plain, or you're living in that part of the country where desertification is the fastest in the world right now. So that is a crisis of sorts that the world is facing. And I'm just giving you examples of India, but India is just not is one of the examples. You see these kind of things happen in Latin America as well. In fact, the depletion of ecological what I call reality, or the ecological systems, is far greater than in what I call Latin America than anywhere else. Brazil is one of the fastest depleting places. In fact, what you're doing to the Amazon forest is something which is going to create catastrophic situations for the world. They're the lungs of the world. But now, and why does that actually happen? That also leads us to an important question as to what is the obsession that we actually have with what we are doing. Because it takes us to an important question of measurement. And that important question of measurement is that because all of us look at economics as a paradigm where continuous growth has to happen, wherein we have to improve our per capita incomes. We do not look at economics as a paradigm wherein we say that we have to improve the quality of life of our people, or improve the quality of life of citizens. So what we are seeing is that for cutting a tree, by cutting a tree, you add to the per capita incomes or the GDP, but you have not found a method wherein you are saying that if you are able to maintain a tree, what it actually does for you, what it does for society. So that is what is the measure that we have to really move forward towards. Uh, but then again, this also leads us to again a question of the present methodologies or present practices that we have within the system. So you are using exploitative tendencies, you're extracting water from the ground, you actually create produce for people. Uh, Great. You've done it. This has been something very important in the past, but you need to move towards more scientific solutions over a period of time. Today, you need solutions wherein you are able to solve for a larger population set in the future as well. It is expected that you will be close to about 10 billion people in the year 2050. So if there are going to be 10 billion people, that means you cannot do it by extracting water out of the ground. You will have to find better scientific methods to really create that agricultural produce. In fact, yes, I do see that there is this whole huge shift towards vegetarianism. We can always debate on the taste or quality or whatever, but you have seen that shift that is happening. But the question is that you will have to find solutions which are far more sustainable over a period of time. Moving ahead, waste management is another issue that we have to talk about. And that when you talk about waste management, what is it that we are doing with the waste that we generate in our cities? In fact, the most polluting city in Asia from a waste point of view is Tokyo, but they are able to really manage it very, very well. You might see it in the backyards of Tokyo, but you don't really see it in the front. You are seeing a lot of waste on the streets. In fact, I've seen this within the United States. Like once I came back after a gap of 2 years because of COVID, I see that this place has become much more dirtier over a period of time. And that is an appalling state of affairs. So that means it's a crisis that the world is facing today in terms of what do we do with waste. We are filling our, we are creating those landfills or whatever, but the question is, what is the kind of ecological impact waste actually have? We have never really looked at those measurements, but it is important that we look at those measurements because for every life that is lost because of this, that means we are losing a certain productive resource or a productivity aspect of that person as we move along. Urbanization is something very interesting that is happening, but it is actually going to create a far greater problem in the future because urbanization also with it tends to bring in something very interesting, and that is that you actually cover up your water resources or reservoirs. In a place like, if you know, most of the cities across the world, they thrive on what I call killing their water resources. They thrive on by killing the lakes that they will actually have or the natural water bodies that they'll have. In a city of Gurgaon in India, which had close to about 70,000 water bodies, we have effectively killed all of them. We are just left with about 200 water bodies today. And then it does create a certain kind of an ecological disaster. It leads you to a very bad example of urbanization and so on and so forth. If you want, you should search for the pictures for the city of Gurgaon. It is something very interesting because you don't need cars, you need boats to ride on that place right now because of waterlogging and the way urbanization has actually happened. Uh, but this is a year which is very fascinating. Of course, the world saw a crisis of sorts in the last 2 years, but what we have seen is that social progress. That means we have seen a downward trend on social progress. That means even for fulfilling basic needs of people, we have actually gone back as a world. In terms of creating opportunities for people, we have gone back in the world. We are seeing a very interesting point in time in the history of mankind or in the history of capitalistic world. For the last 20 to 30 years, we saw a massive progress that actually did happen. But in the last 2 years, we have seen a massive downfall on social progress. We are also seeing something important, and that started happening about a decade back. And one of the aspects of social progress is about democracies, as to how democracies are also facing a challenge, as to how are we electing a certain set of leaders. We have our own set of, in the US, you've had the Donald Trump, right, wrong, or whatever. That's a debate to really have. But you're seeing the rise of the right that we are seeing. And when I say the rise of the right, that means the world is actually becoming a lot more insane than it was. In fact, there is a whole huge reflection within the university system itself that we are becoming far more what I call sensitive to things. The debates that you have today are more about what I call how to have pronouns than to actually have debates which are far more serious. In fact, what I see debates happening around campuses today are uh, pronouns, right? This is an important aspect, but without really seeing how the world is actually getting challenged. It's your survival which is challenged because human race might not actually exist in the next 500 years. You need to solve for that rather than actually going into some mundane things and all those kind of things. I was told not to say this, but I still thought I should share this view on this. But the next thing that we have to really see is prioritizing the sustainable development. Uh, and how do we prioritize sustainable development? What does it actually mean for us? What are those 17 sustainable development goals and those 169 targets that we have? They have tried to measure or they have tried to create measurements across it. But I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot of a certain view. Clean water and sanitation. If we really look at the pace of change that we are seeing, we are not achieving clean water aspect by 2030, what we have actually thought through. We will just achieve 94 of it. So if you really look at it, the trajectory that we are seeing across the world, we are on basic drinking water, we'll just achieve 94. On safe managed drinking water, we'll just get to 81 as a score. So that means the world is just not progressing enough. We are not focusing on issues which are important for the society. If you really look at open defecation, we will achieve that quite possibly, but we are not going to achieve basic sanitation or safely managed sanitation. We are still lagging behind. In fact, one of the countries which used to create a huge problem on the open defecation achievement was India, but it has actually achieved nearly 100% open defecation free situation right now. So there are two sets of data. That's a separate issue. But again, these are the sets of data points which I thought I should share on basic hygiene. We are still not going to achieve. We are just moving towards a target of 78. That means there are those opportunities that exist for you as you move along. But factors critical for global health, these are factors which are very critical. In fact, if we just follow this, we will save close to about 800,000 lives in this process. And if you just want to understand what is the economic impact of this, if we just multiply this number of 800,000 by per capita incomes of a certain country, say if the per capita income of US is say $50,000, 800,000 by $50,000 would give you a number of, or the kind of impact on a yearly basis that you have by saving these lives. This is a huge, huge impact. Look at the economic impact or the productivity that you can generate by saving these lives. In fact, this leads us to an important question that people would always have: vaccination, no vaccination, and so on and so forth. We'll not get here into this, but what I'm trying to say here is that for every life saved, there is a productivity gain that you actually see over a period of time in economy. Wetlands, we did talk about it, that as to how we create cities and kill our wetlands. Stress on water resources is crazy. So if you really look at it, countries which are going to face huge catastrophes or which are sitting on a catastrophic situation even right now are countries like India. You would see this, the sub-Saharan Africa or parts up there. You would see the Middle East that is actually having a lot of problem. In fact, US is facing a challenge. If you actually dig deeper into US, you will find that the dark blues are critical. There are locations which are facing critical water issues. So California being one of them. But overall, US seems to be very, what I call, very stable. But there are locations within US which are facing a critical water crisis. So if you really look at this whole Pacific belt of states, there is a challenge that you are facing, and you need to really overcome this. Then, of course, you have to understand something on affordable and clean energy and move forward and things. So just very quickly, I'll just leave these slides with you because I'm just left with about 5 more minutes, as Richard has instructed me to look at. But I wanted to bring this aspect of life, or what is really happening to the world because of this whole issue of climate. We are facing, or we are in middle of the 6th mass extinction. So we are losing the what I call species at a faster rate than any other point in the history of the world, or history of, when I say the existence of Earth. That means if we don't set things right now, we are actually going to be talking about a very, very difficult situation. But having said that, I think nature is not dependent on humans or humanity at large. The nature will survive without humans. We have always lost species and people have survived. I think the arrogance of the humans have brought us to where we are. So it might actually be a good idea that humans become extinct for the world. So that could be a very positive thing to see. Faster once. Yes, faster the better. But then the question is, it could be a good, interesting idea that it happens. But what is the role of corporates here? So what about this? What corporates can actually do? Can they create business models to really solve the problems of the world? Definitely they can. If you really look at it, one is that existing capitalistic system has historically ignored the social and environmental aspects. Corporates need to start looking at these. Profit maximization outlook at the expense of communities needs to be dropped. We have seen a whole huge disparity that actually exists across the world. In fact, the challenge of democracies that we are facing today is more a challenge of economic disparity than anything else, because it becomes a battle between the have and the have-nots. So it becomes an important issue for us to resolve in the future. In fact, transition towards ESG practices and sustainable development goals is a good start, but this is not the end all. You need to do far deeper and far bigger than just saying environment, social, and governance, because there are people at large, there is education at large, there is so much that needs to be done. There are close to about 60 to 70 ideas or things that we have to look at. Look at those 169 indicators on SDGs that have to be worked on, just not one single aspect of environment. And then having said that, creating value for your businesses, like you have to look at reducing cost, reducing pollutions. You have to move towards a situation wherein you make your enterprises far more productive as you go along. Pollution is what? Pollution is a function of underutilization of resources or bad utilization of resources. You need to find ways and solutions wherein you're able to utilize your resources better and move forward with it. So positive impact of going green on company share prices. This is very obvious, but enterprises who have done it, they have actually had a better, what I call outcomes over a period of time. Apple is one enterprise which is moving into that direction, wherein they're saying that they're really recycling everything they're using, and people like it. Today, youth is liking, if you really say youth as the future consumers, they like recycled products. They are willing to actually spend money on it. So that means there is a huge market opportunity for that as well. Having said that, uh, challenges to the approach is that you just cannot say, this is one of the things that I'm doing. You need to be embedded. You need to create it as a purpose within the organization. You need to think and breathe what you're really saying. You need to say, and your purpose has to be that rather than say somebody like Nestle, which says that I'm a food and a beverage company, to saying that I'm a nutrition company, or somebody which says I'm a health and a fitness company, rather than a shoe or a footwear company. So that is where you have to define your purpose. Each one of us will have to say our purpose is to really doing or solving the problems of the world that we are looking at. So you have to move towards creating value or shared value over a period of time. And having said that, what I would like to say is that if you really want to solve the problems of the world, you have to really look at social issues, solve for the social issues. You have to look at shared values per se, and you have to look at what I would call as resilient systems, creating resilient systems which are able to face the kind of crisis that you're facing, because the world tomorrow is going to face far more crises or bigger crises than it has ever seen in its history. And that is where the human race would actually have to survive and look at it. But the least or the last thing that I have to say is it's about lifestyle for environment. Each one of us will have to do something for the society at large. Because typically we always talk about, oh, government can do X and the corporations can do X, but we never think as to what people can do. How is it that we can contribute to reducing the carbon footprint that we as individuals have? What are the actions that we can take to really make it a possibility? Maybe there is a far better movement in the United States because as countries are developed, you have moved into, say, cycling or whatever. You look at some better methods of transportation, but that we have not been able to do it in India. We need to move into those directions and really talk about lifestyle for environment. If we are able to do that across the world, we are able to reduce the impact of what we are really seeing and really solve for the future. So these are a few ideas that I wanted to share, but there is a larger deck which I'll leave with you. But what I wanted to say here is that ESG is important, but that is just the beginning. Looking at environment, social governance frameworks, and reporting is important. But you need to measure it on everyday basis. You need to understand the impact on everyday basis. Because at the end of the day, if we are able to solve for it, we are able to improve the quality of life of citizens. And that's the eventual goal of any economy or any country.
You
Thank you.
should stop sharing because you've got a black screen now.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Amit, thank you very much for, this kind of sobering view of the situation with the world. This is the kind of thing that you hear about a lot. And this course is going to take up where Amit's comments kind of leave off and look at what businesses are doing in order to address climate tech and sustainability. It almost, after a presentation like this, makes you feel like, I don't want to take the crisis for the climate lightly. This really is extremely serious. And your last point about we all need to feel individual responsibility is exactly right. However, I think that where I want to go with this is that there is a role for business. And basically, one of the most important things that business does is to provide a distinctive kind of incentive for people to alter their behavior. Purchasing something is an act of free will. People buy something either because they want to or they need to. And so you're not forcing people to try to change. You're giving them a better way. And that's absolutely something that I hear that I don't hear enough in these discussions about climate change. I was in a public program with someone who was representing a large government organization. We won't go into any more detail than that. And he was talking about similar things and and so I said, so what are the measures that you can do? And he says, well, government has two things that they can do. They can regulate or they can tax. Or the flip side of taxing is provide financial incentives. And none of those address what people want out of their lives. That is, regulation, hopefully in a democracy, will somehow represent what people care about. But really, it's business that provides people with things that they want to buy. So business is where you find the pattern of disruptive innovation, where some new product or service is what people prefer. And so they give up their old way. They're not forced to stop using what they used to use. They give it up because they want to. And the other point about business is that the solutions that a business provides have to meet basic economic constraints. You cannot continue to provide something to people that costs more than you can sell it for. And that's actually really important when you're looking at things like alternative fuels, when you're looking at other areas that we really need to have some different solutions coming into the world. So this series is going to focus on different kinds of businesses that are driven primarily by a desire to address climate change and sustainability. As was in your comments, all businesses really must consider ESG. And you're seeing a huge spread in ESG reporting across just about every public company now. But if something is driven by climate tech or sustainability, it's a subset of all the businesses that somehow gain some improvement as well as doing their main business. But that's not really the point of the business. So you will hear people talking about autonomous vehicles being good for as a measure to address climate change. That's not really what they're selling them with, right? They're selling autonomous vehicles for safety. They're selling autonomous vehicles as an improvement to the efficiency of your life because you can read a magazine or play a computer game while you're driving. But there are a number of areas where it's hard to tell to what extent climate change really factors into the main purpose of the business. Smart cities is a very good example. One of the elements of smart cities is more efficient energy systems, more efficient movement of people throughout the city. But it's really hard to tell just what percentage of the whole budget of a smart city project is really going into addressing waste issues or water issues, as well as energy sources. There are three things you can do. One is you can try to minimize the causes of climate change, right? You can improve your energy sources. You can make energy in a different way. You can mitigate the effects of climate change that's going on, or you can have services that will help people to cope. What's going to happen to these 600 million people when the Ganges starts to dry up? That's somebody is going to have to come up with some solution. Yes, I notice a definite tendency toward greenwashing, but if you look into what the companies are doing, usually you can kind of see what's greenwashing and what's real. I was just reviewing a large set of government grant proposals and noticed some grant proposals throwing in the word sustainability for something that had absolutely nothing to do with the environment. So, yeah, you have to watch out for that. With regard to the kind of concrete topics we're going to look at, mobility is one. And this is the one where Asia is probably invested a lot more than here. Energy production, also transmission and storage. So you have new sources of energy like biomass and hydrogen. Batteries is actually kind of driven by the whole mobility sector, so they overlap quite a bit. The circular economy, recycling and upcycling, is a major factor that we will be looking at a number of the weeks in the series. Agriculture, smart farming, more resilient crop development, also cities, infrastructure, smart cities, plus things like not only green buildings, but green construction techniques and also green materials. And then you have some really interesting industry-specific problems. We may not be able to put it in the series, but Meta has a joint project with the National University of Singapore to develop a tropical green data center because most data centers use so much cooling to keep the servers cool that they're really horrible things to put in tropical countries. So they're trying to figure out how to solve this problem with this major research effort down in Singapore. It's a fascinating area because data centers are incredible energy hogs. So those are the things we're going to look at. Unfortunately, Asia has kind of lagged behind in terms of new investment in sustainability in general. This is not just venture capital. This is all capital invested in sustainability linked startups. So, but it's probably the majority venture capital. Notice that in terms of in 2021, there were over 1,200 deals to startup companies in regard that are linked to sustainability. Only 85 of those were in Asia. The vast majority were in North America or in Europe. If you look a little bit more close to this, specific to venture capital investment in climate tech, with regard to the deal count, North America and Europe account for the majority, but Asia accounts for a goodly number. So certainly in terms of the amount invested, Asia counts for a smaller percent, but that has to do with the different costs of setting up a business and different kind of valuations that you get in different stages of economic development. But still, Asia doesn't look like it's kind of leading at this point until you start to look at things like climate tech investment in specific areas. So if you add mobility and transport, China itself accounted for almost 1/3 of all of the investment in climate tech in 2020. The top 10 climate tech investment hubs, okay, so Silicon Valley comes in first, great. But there's Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Nanjing, Hangzhou, and Bangalore in India as being the top places where climate tech investments are going on. But it's almost all mobility. So if you look in the US and Canada, investment in climate tech is going into mobility, 45% or so, but quite a bit into heavy industry. Then you have direct, greenhouse gas capture and storage. You have energy, new energy production, data production and data analysis, and things into the built environment. This is smart construction, that kind of stuff. But in China, it's all mobility and transport. So, not surprisingly, China is way ahead of just about anywhere else in regard to electric vehicles and plug-in electric hybrids. So, just in the first half of 2022, there were more than 2,400, I'm sorry, 2.4 million, let me get the unit right, 2.4 million electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids were sold in China, right? That's more than, more than twice as much in all of Europe and 4 times as much as in North America. The growth rate is absolutely incredible. More than twice as many were sold in the first half of 2022 as were sold in the first half of 2021. Now, some of that is related to the shutdowns of cities in China. The market in China is incredibly volatile. 1 month will show a 40% increase, and the next month will show a 50% decrease. But gradually, this is not really so much investment in new technology. This is the spread of a technology throughout the mainstream market, is what's happening with EVs in China. There are still some great government incentives. Your purchase tax is waived if you buy an EV. You may know that in many Chinese cities, to cut down on air pollution, they will only allow cars with certain number plates to be driven on certain days. So odd number plates would go on odd days of the month, and even number plates would go on even days of the month. That kind of thing doesn't apply to electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids. You can drive on any day you want to. You even get 2 hours of free parking in a public parking lot if you have an electric vehicle or a plug-in hybrid. And, the price range is really mid-market. Everything from a very cheap $4,500 car all the way up to Tesla. So, this is major spread throughout a market, not really new business anymore. The number of charger stations for EVs is showing an incredible amount for China, right? 1/3 of all the world's charger stations back in 2019. And this is growing incredibly fast. Notice that China charging stations tend to be fast charge, and they tend to be owned by the public. So they're really making the use of electric vehicles as practical as possible. The mass market spread of EVs is really pushing new electric vehicle technology. And it's also pushing especially battery technology. So you notice that just worldwide, battery tech funding really jumped up in 2021. And of the top investors in broad EV technology, 5 of the top 10 are very closely connected to China. So these are areas in which China is clearly taking a lead over what's happening in the rest of the world, despite the fact that in terms of percentage of new vehicles sold, places like Scandinavia, Norway, and Sweden already are up to like 75% of all new vehicles sold are electric vehicles. Beyond the battery EV, look at these venture capital investments in hydrogen technologies, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So the first big one was in Japan from 2000 to 2005 or so. There was an amazing amount of government money available for R&D, and industry money matched it right and left. The second surge was kind of in South Korea. It wasn't as big a surge, but it's stable in terms of growing up to a larger amount. But in recent years, since the statement in 2014, especially by Xi Jinping about new energy vehicles being important, the amount of investment into hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in China has really taken over the lead in the world. I'm sorry, this is not investment. I'm looking at the wrong thing. This is patent filings. So this is even more interesting because it's not just how much money is flowing into something, it's how much research and development people are getting for the money that's being put into these areas. So you're seeing hydrogen fuel cell buses all over the place in China. They still tend to be deployed in large regional cities like Guangzhou or Zhangzhou. But there are, 20 or 30 major domestic brands of fuel cell buses, and they produced 2,000 units in the first half of 2022 for city buses that are hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. One of the companies that's done well is the Canadian company Ballard Systems, which was early in getting contracts with Chinese government entities. They would enter into consortia with a local manufacturer who would do design localization and so forth. So these have been showing up on the streets for more than 7 or 8 years now, and the number is taking off. Japan and South Korea are putting a lot of effort behind fuel cell hybrid vehicles. There are 3 cars available in the United States, 2 from Japanese companies, 1 from Hyundai. Charging stations are still a big deal in the US, a problem, but they're growing a lot in China, and in places like Japan and South Korea, compressed gas charging stations had already been used by most of the taxi fleets. And so moving from that to a hydrogen charging station is not such a big technical change. Hyundai is building a huge fuel cell factory in Guangzhou, and they also have their first production models of a semi-trailer truck that is running on hydrogen fuel cells. So, other countries are getting in on this. You don't see this much from American domestic makers at all. Kind of kicking and screaming, thanks to Tesla, people are getting serious about making battery electric vehicles. But hydrogen is still largely these Asian makers. Even further ahead, Toyota actually came up with a racing car that's a combustion-based hydrogen-powered vehicle. And Mr. Toyota himself drove it in a race in 2021. The kind of dark side of this is that because of the safety of charging it with hydrogen, it had to leave the racetrack every time it needed to be recharged. And they charged it at a site off the racetrack, and then it came back. So it was absolutely not in the running for winning the race, but it completed the entire 24-hour race. That leads us to the whole question of hydrogen production itself, because a lot of hydrogen production actually has a negative carbon footprint. You create CO2 through the technologies that are used to create hydrogen. The dirtiest hydrogen is called gray hydrogen. The energy source are petroleum-based, most of it. And, you reform it or gasify it, and you get this kind of emissions out of the production process. Better is if you can use fossil fuels along with some sort of a carbon capture technology. People who take that approach are talking about blue hydrogen. But the real holy grail is green hydrogen, which is usually electrolysis of water. And that works if the electricity behind the electrolysis comes from the renewable sources, right? If you're burning hydrocarbons in order to generate electricity to create hydrogen, that's not a good idea. So in China right now, almost all hydrogen production is still gray, but there are more than 30 government projects that involve green hydrogen that have been started since 2019. In India, Prime Minister Modi mentioned that green hydrogen would be an important part of making a quantum leap in the national energy strategy to being totally energy independent by the year 2047. So there's been a lot of investment in Japan for really more than 10 years into hydrogen and hydrogen fuel cell technologies. Some of it has to do with green hydrogen production, but most of it is really on the fuel cell side. But I'm very interested to see big Japanese companies trying to establish international supply chains for hydrogen. So this Australian company that makes green hydrogen, H2U, received a major investment from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, which was serving as the leader of a group of investors. That just happened this past year. And, South Korea has a plan for hydrogen to provide 10% of the energy needs of municipalities by 2030 and 30% by 2040. So hydrogen is something to watch, and it's moving faster in Asia than it is here. Smart cities are an area in which you see an awful lot of work, for example, in China, right? The percentage of all of the smart city projects in the world, and there are hundreds, if not more than 1,000, almost half of them are in China. And with regard to the amount of investment in smart cities, China accounts for about 23%. So you're seeing pretty big investments in Japan and in other Asian Pacific countries, as well as just elsewhere in the world, in regard to smart city projects. I think that what is of concern to me is that a city is a combination of so many different systems that most of the smart city projects end up focusing on one or two systems, mobility of people, right, as opposed to wastewater management. And that kind of thing makes me a little bit concerned that we really need to have more kind of open dialogue between smart city projects about what they're going to focus on. But Asia doesn't have to be ahead for there to be interesting things coming out of Asia. And I want to mention just a few of the companies that we turned up when we did a survey this summer. So in South Korea, there's a company named Forsyth or Forsys that, among the kind of upcycling it's trying to do, is turning discarded fishing nets into a replacement for rebar in 3D printed concrete. If you put in concrete by 3D printing technologies, you cannot use steel rebar. So the material that they get from the old fishing nets will reinforce the concrete in a way that you couldn't do with traditional materials anyway. There's this company from Taiwan called MiniWiz that keeps doing one after another really interesting projects. This is not something a Silicon Valley investor would like at all, I don't think, because they keep doing one project after another without trying to become the world's next Google. But they sell a trash presso machine, which makes solid trash, converts solid trash into architectural tiles. And this is actually competing with a number of other companies around East Asia. One in Indonesia is called Rebrick, that is making architectural building materials out of trash. But one of the things that they did was they decided that they would get into quick assembly of medical wards. This was kind of a COVID pandemic response, using recycled materials to quickly put together things for medical treatment. They also make reusable boxes to ship Nike shoes. So they've got a contract with Nike. Another one that was interesting was Green Pod Labs, and this is an area we're not talking too much about in this series, about foods, circular economy around foods, that has developed a sachet that uses natural freshness mechanisms in fruits and vegetables to increase their shelf life. And they have all these pictures on their website about apples that have been inside their drawer for 3 weeks versus apples that have been in another drawer for 3 weeks. But one of the most interesting ones, and this is how local conditions can lead to a very interesting business idea. The company Fool in India collects the flower waste from festivals and ceremonies where all the flowers are dumped into the Ganges River, and it uses this material to make incense that has no charcoal in it, so it's cleaner burning incense than traditional incense, and also biodegradable packaging. They collect something like 6 million pounds of flower waste every year to do this, and they just got started in 2017. So what we're interested in this course are kind of interesting companies that are finding ways to have a good impact on the environment. They're really driven by this kind of environmental consciousness or desire to make things better. And my last sort of content slide is to just talk about the first 4 sessions we have coming up from next week. So Mr. Izumo, who was the very first delegate from Japan in what at the time was called the Asia Pacific Student Entrepreneurship Summit back at Stanford in 1999. He was the very first student delegate, and I've stayed in touch with him all these years as he has created his company Euglena and grown it, taken it public. They now have manufacturing in Thailand, and I think they're starting manufacturing in Indonesia, where you have this microorganism that people argue whether it's a plant or an animal, that can be used to make alternative fuels as well as a lot of other things. In a couple of weeks, Mr. Kawasaki is going to come with MJ, Mr. Jain, who is the executive chairman of a company called Ideation 3X, which is basically buying up recycling companies around India in order to have a major network of upcycling centers. So that's our program on the 13th. On the 20th, we have one of the partners of a venture capital firm that is focusing on climate tech in Singapore. So Mike is going to come in, and I can't say for sure, but we're asking one of his portfolio companies to join him. This portfolio company is really interesting, and so I'm hoping that we can have that. And then 4 weeks, 4 weeks from today, on the 21st of October, Mr. Peng is coming back. This will be the 3rd time I've asked Mr. Peng to speak in these seminars. He developed a really interesting technology for scrubbing emissions gas from power plants using seawater. And he then applied that to scrubbing the emissions from ships. And now he's moving on to even develop new kinds of ways of doing this to focus even more on carbon dioxide, not just on the nitrous oxide and sulfur compounds that he was getting out to start with. So that's the way the center is starting off. We've got some time to have questions. I'd be happy to take a few questions. If you're in the audience on Zoom, I assume that some of these marks are questions in chat. But one last thing I'd like to say is thanks very much to Mr. Ryan Zhang of Boston College, who volunteered this summer to work with me on research into climate tech and sustainability startups in Asia. It was great to work with him, and I hope that he's actually in Oslo, Norway this week presenting the results of his research. So that's our situation for the seminars. Let me pull a couple of things from chat and read them out. It seems that circular economies will be critical for waste management and overall sustainable business processes. But how do we scale circular economies across the globalization framework that we have today? This is actually a very profound question, because it gets into the whole kind of relationship between political jurisdiction and responsibility for any of this resource management. One of the previous comments that came in as a direct message to me was about, water management. Somebody upstream is a different political jurisdiction than the people downstream. how do you get them to cooperate with each other in order to handle that problem, say on the Mekong River or most other major waterways in various parts of the world? Um, Amit, what do you think about getting the political people to try to march to the same drummer?
So, like this is a very important point that is being made here. Like, what do you mean by the globalization framework? I think today the challenge that the world faces is that we are disintegrating in many, many interesting ways. Like we are talking about a world order which is possibly not working together. But for the crisis that we have to find a solution that we work on a similar what I call path, where we work in tandem for really achieving it. It just cannot be a one person, one country effort. It has to be a collective effort. I think the failure thus far of all these climate initiatives or ideas pertaining to it have failed because we have never looked at collective action. We have always looked at individual action as countries. And then I think there is a larger blame game that actually happens in terms of saying, oh, US has been far more polluting and you're actually taking away the opportunity from the developing world for really doing or upscaling the lives of people and things. I think we need to change that. We need to also change the very paradigm of understanding as to how to, in a globalized world, what do we mean by success? What do we mean by solutions? So that also has to change very, very significantly.
I'd take that one step further and say that when people talk about globalization, most of the time they're still thinking in an old 19th century trade framework of, how many oranges will you buy from me and how much steel can I sell to you? And as long as that's the case, whenever you have a multilateral group of political entities coming together, they're all going to look at self interest first and see almost a zero sum game between what's good for my people versus what's good for somebody else. And we really have to come to a different kind of understanding of global engagement in order to see that, these problems are existential for the human race, right? This is not something where we've got a different stage of development, and so we should be able to pollute like people used to pollute in the advanced countries. That's one that you will hear a lot. Or that we have people who are willing to make these kinds of changes in their lifestyle, and so other people should do that just because we tell them to. I think that we really have to have more of an understanding of how we face this issue together. So, what about questions from the audience? If you'd take a mic.
Thank you both for taking the time to speak with us today. So my question is, I think one of the charts that you showed in this presentation earlier, I thought it was particularly intriguing. It was about the distribution of investment in different areas of climate, I think in China and in the US. I think China was super uniform or super concentrated in mobility, and US it seemed a little bit more uniform. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about why that's the case, and if where do you think other countries like India, Brazil, Japan, where do you think they fall in that spectrum?
Well, I think it, of course, is government policy. And the government policy in China was looking for things that would have a good impact on society, would be something where you could have measurable results relatively soon. I think it was really pretty amazing because they said they were going to do it and they're doing it. Even faster adoption of electric vehicles than the original government planning specified. So I think that that's a huge factor. And, these are climate tech is a huge problem. It involves so many different areas that I guess people just didn't notice a lot of the other areas that are being noticed here. Either that, or possibly it is the fact that the government pulls as much as the government feels like they can pull. And if you have, national and important industries like steel production, which is a pretty awful thing traditional techniques for steel production generate an awful lot of CO2, or coal-fired power plants. And I will give China a lot of credit because they have invested a lot in new renewable energy. Wind power has been a huge area of investment inside China, so have solar cells. But in regard to the kind of really new technology development, I think this was kind of pick something, focus on it, and have a dedicated program, and we'll be the world leader. Maybe you see similar things with regard to artificial intelligence, right? Good, great question. A couple of people back in the back.
I have a thought on that question that you just
Okay.
asked, and I think it's also that a country that has far more control over both the resources, which is the materials, and then the supply chain and the manufacturing of it, it's easier to fast track whatever you're trying to do, right? Even if India wants to do it, they cannot because they don't have the raw materials. They don't make batteries in India. So I think that is kind of like a sweet spot for China because they can accelerate.
So they had access to more components in the supply chain. That's a very interesting observation. Thank you.
Thank you both for your time. My name is Christine Poo. I'm finishing up my PhD on the relationship between water poverty and climate change. So I appreciate the nod for water and sanitation. My question is with respect to what are the different types of roles and settings where you feel like the role of climate tech or the role of government or the role of more philanthropic driven organizations really shine. I feel like in conversations closer to my world where the money isn't necessarily generated by customers all the time, it's always a lack of financial sustainability, right? It's a lack of money, it's lack of capital. But there's so many studies done boiling down the number it would require to give everyone access to water and sanitation. And it's not that large compared to what we spend on a lot of things here. And I'm curious, where do you see that in terms of the dance between these organizations in generating the incentives to act, but also the accountability to bring everyone along rather than increasing the economic inequality that we're seeing growing? Thank you.
So, very important question in terms of one, what is the role of the philanthropic organizations as I see it? So philanthropy is important, but we need to fundamentally understand that whatever ideas philanthropic organizations fund or support, they need to find an economic model within that support system itself. Because if you're not doing it, that means you're just not sustainable at all. It is like this, like when you talk about COVID vaccination effort, there was a lot of philanthropic thing that actually happened to really create that vaccination. But eventually there was a business model at play that actually happened. So you need to find that business model from the philanthropic enterprises itself to really say that we have to solve it. Having said that, I think there is enough and more opportunity if we are able to solve, say, giving water to people. Because when you say water poverty or whatever, people are not having access to water. We have actually seen examples in India. There is a company called Janajal. What they're doing is that people are able to get something like 10 liters of water for drinking at a price of rupees 10. So 1 rupee a liter or whatever. That means like you're able to get 100 liters for about $1.2, $1.3. But there's an economic model around it. And he's able to make it very, very profitable. So that means even in a very simple setting, you're able to make profits. That's the same thing that you will be able to do with sanitation itself. You've had examples. There is this, I'm forgetting the name of the company, they actually have toilets in various cities wherein they've actually been able to create a model where people are going there, paying for it, and they are sustainable in itself. So you have examples after examples. So you can create solutions around there. And I am also convinced of one more thing. The moment you start giving things for free, that means they do not get respected per se. People should pay for services to a certain extent, even if it is a very small amount. The government can actually do a direct benefit transfer if you feel that there are very poor people, they cannot pay for it. There could be a benefit transfer into the accounts of the people and they can pay for it. That should happen because they need to understand that this is what is the value of service that is actually being provided.
So I think that this is the complex interaction of different systems. You've got the government system, you've got the for-profit business sector, you've got the nonprofit / philanthropic sector, and then you've got the individual people in the population. The most important thing is to make each of those sectors fulfill their core functions in a positive way that interacts with the other sectors. So business, for-profit business, its primary responsibility is to create value for the owners of the business. I hate to sound like Friedman, but still, you know, that's their fiduciary responsibility as the directors, as the managers of the company. But it is a good thing for a for-profit company to do corporate social responsibility. And that's not just marketing. I mean, this is something where the company is taking this broader view that you're talking about, Amit, where the company is not just trying to make a profit and maximize profit. The company is trying to do more good for people. That the measurement of the company's success is not just money, it's how many people, what kind of inclusiveness they can provide in terms of the benefits that they are generating. So that's even in the for-profit sector. In the nonprofit sector, the biggest difference is that there is no such thing as exit. So the primary indicator of success for a nonprofit is going to be sustainability. The sustainability of the enterprise that is really helping to create a meaningful change. So the essence of the essence of social entrepreneurship is you want to create a change in the world. You want to change the world, but you can't sell the company to somebody in 7 years. You really have to plan on having a sustainable model where people probably are providing funding, but you're able to get money from the philanthropists as well. So I think that all of that's critical. The most important thing is not to expect a company to regulate itself, because that is not the natural function of a company. You're asking it to have conflict of interest against itself. So government is the natural regulatory body. When you're trying to come up with these sort of issues in regard to water management, the most simple kind of thing I can say is keep the different parties using their natural function, what they're supposed to do, right? Governments are supposed to provide people with a safe environment with opportunity now, and they're supposed to invest in the future of the people too. So, you know, something that fits in with that, let the government do it. That's a great question. I'd love to learn more about your thesis too.
And just the name of the enterprise is Sulabh, and thanks to Prakash online who just told me the name, Sulabh Suchale. Yeah.
So we had a couple of questions about green hydrogen. One question on Zoom. One question was about, you know, is the energy balance of using electrolysis going to be a net positive? And another is, you know, are there any factors that are preventing rapid investment of green hydrogen in the United States as compared to other countries? I think that the biggest problem with green hydrogen right now is cost. The cost is somewhere between $2.5 and $6 per kilogram of hydrogen produced. And a kilogram of hydrogen is a lot of hydrogen, but still, that's a lot more expensive than other ways of even producing hydrogen. So that means that there will be research going on, and until somehow the research gets into dealing with the economic constraints of actually using this technique for hydrogen production, it's not going to spread a whole lot. So other people are probably betting on other things as shorter term ways of achieving some success. But those are great questions too. Any further questions from the audience? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hey, my name is Jessica. I'm an economics major working on my undergrad degree. I had a question for Dr. Kapoor specifically about the metrics that we talked about or that you discussed. You showed 4 metrics frameworks on the PowerPoint, and I'd love to hear more about A, what the difference between those frameworks are, and B, what you perceive to be the most ideal frameworks for actually getting businesses to design the products they should design for sustainable development.
I have a biased view on that. So, in terms of the metric, which I believe would be one of the most appropriate ones, I think we should start looking at the social progress metric, wherein we are actually talking about basics of well-being, then opportunity, and so on and so forth. So, that is where we actually look at an integrated view of the world in terms of either we talk about sanitation to education to opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. So, I would request you to look at socialprogress.org. So I'm one of the people who had actually written that framework. So I find it to be a far more robust framework in terms of understanding what is right and what is wrong with the world and where the world is actually progressing. There are many frameworks that have been given, but this was a framework which was developed in sync with Amartya Sen, who was a Nobel laureate, and then others as well, to really push forward with that idea as to what are the right measures and the right metric to really look at. But we can always talk about it on the sidelines as well in more detail. Yeah.
So I think now is a good time for us to close the formal part of the program. We'll stay online with Zoom for a few more minutes for really informal conversation. And people in the audience are welcome to stay. But thank you so much for coming today and for your interest in this topic. I hope you really enjoy the series. Look forward to seeing everybody next week. Thank you.